Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're re-listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Now, close your eyes and let your mind drift back over 8 centuries to a time when the very act of eating was fraught with danger, disappointment, and deprivation. Tonight we'll uncover the sobering truth about why medieval festivals, despite their reputation for raillery and excess, were actually wild displays of desperation rather than abundance. The festivals of medieval Europe were indeed wild, but not in the way you might imagine. They were wild because they represented rare moments when the crushing weight of daily hunger could be temporarily lifted. For most people living in this era, a festival wasn't just a celebration, it was a matter of survival. Consider the Feast of Fools celebrated across medieval Europe in the depths of winter. To modern eyes, it might appear to be nothing more than raucous entertainment with peasants, and clergy reversing roles, dancing in the streets, and consuming vast quantities of food and drink. But beneath this veneer of merriment lay a darker truth. This festival coincided with the leanest time of year when food stores were running dangerously low, and the specter of starvation loomed large over every household. The wildness of these celebrations stemmed from genuine desperation. When a community managed to slaughter a pig, or when the lord of the manor decided to distribute extra rations, the response was explosive. People gorged themselves not out of gluttony, but because they never knew when they would eat well again. The frenzied consumption that characterized these festivals was the behavior of people who lived constantly on the edge of hunger. Take the harvest festivals that marked the end of summer. These weren't gentle gatherings of Thanksgiving, but rather desperate attempts to consume as much fresh food as possible. Before winter's grip made fresh produce nothing more than a distant memory, entire communities would work themselves into exhaustion, processing grain, preserving meat, and fermenting whatever fruits they could gather. The celebration that followed was wild because it represented both relief and terror. Relief that they had survived another growing season, and terror at what the coming winter might bring. The religious festivals presented their own unique form of wildness. During Carnival, the period before Lent, people would engage in what appeared to be hedonistic excess. But this wasn't mere indulgence. It was the last chance to consume meat, dairy, and eggs before the church imposed its strict fasting requirements. For 40 days, the faithful would be expected to subsist on an even more restricted diet than usual. So they ate with wild abandon, knowing that the alternative was weeks of knowing hunger sanctified by religious duty. Even the nobles, who lived in relative comfort compared to the peasantry, approached their festivals with a wildness born of different pressures. Their elaborate feasts were displays of power and wealth, but they were also desperate attempts to maintain their position in a brutal social hierarchy. A lord who could provide adequate entertainment for his guests risked losing face, and with it, the political alliances that kept him in power. The food served at these noble festivities was often as much spectacle as sustenance. Whole roasted peacocks with their feathers restored, elaborate sugar sculptures and dishes that required dozens of servants to prepare and present. This wasn't just showing off. It was a form of medieval warfare conducted through cuisine. The message was clear. I have so much wealth that I can afford to waste it on food that exists purely to impress you. But even these lavish displays had their own form of wildness. The very excess that was meant to demonstrate security often revealed underlying anxieties. The more elaborate the feast, the more desperate the hosts need to prove their status. And beneath the golden plates and exotic spices lay the same fundamental uncertainty that plagued all medieval dining. Would this abundance last? The preparation for these festivals revealed just how precarious medieval food security really was. Months before a major celebration, households would begin setting aside provisions. Every spare coin was saved. Every extra egg was preserved. Every scrap of meat was carefully stored. The wildness of the eventual celebration was proportional to the sacrifice that preceded it. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval festival wildness was how quickly it could turn dangerous. When large groups of undernourished people suddenly gained access to rich foods and strong drink, the results were often catastrophic. Festival records are filled with accounts of people literally eating themselves to death, their weakened digestive systems unable to cope with the sudden influx of rich fare. The alcohol that flowed so freely at these gatherings wasn't just for merriment. In a world where clean water was often scarce, fermented beverages were safer to drink than water from questionable sources. But the quality of these drinks was wildly inconsistent. Scrupulous brewers would water down their ale to make it stretch further, while others might accidentally create brews so strong they could poison the unwary drinker. The wildness extended to the very atmosphere of these festivals. With so many people crowded together, often in unsanitary conditions, disease spread rapidly. What began as a celebration could quickly become a breeding ground for plague, dysentery, or other deadly ailments. The desperate desire to participate in rare moments of abundance often overrode common sense about safety and hygiene. Musicians and entertainers at these festivals weren't just providing amusement. They were offering psychological relief from the constant stress of survival. Their wild performances, their bawdy songs, and their acrobatic displays served as a release valve for communities living under tremendous pressure. The wilder the entertainment, the greater the psychological need it was fulfilling. The games and competitions that were central to many festivals also reflected this underlying desperation. Contests of strength, skill, and endurance weren't just entertainment. They were training for the daily battle of survival. A man who could win a wrestling match might also be strong enough to work longer hours in the fields. A woman skilled at spinning could contribute more to her family's meager income. Even the religious aspects of these festivals carried undertones of wildness. Processions that might seem sedate to modern observers were often charged with genuine fervor, born of desperation. When your daily existence was precarious, when disease and starvation were constant threats, appeals to divine intervention weren't mere ritual. They were matters of life and death. The seasonal nature of medieval festivals also contributed to their wild character. These weren't evenly spaced celebrations throughout the year, but rather intense bursts of activity that coincided with crucial moments in the agricultural calendar. The wildness came from the compressed time frame in which communities had to accomplish everything: harvesting, preserving, celebrating, and preparing for the next season. As we drift towards sleep, consider this. The wildness of medieval festivals wasn't born of excess, but of scarcity. It wasn't the product of abundance, but of desperation. These weren't people celebrating because they had too much, but because they had so little that any break from the ordinary felt like a miracle worth commemorating with wild abandon. The next time you attend a festival or celebration, take a moment to appreciate the security that allows you to enjoy it purely for pleasure. Medieval festival goers approached their celebrations with the wild intensity of people who knew that such moments of joy were rare and precious beyond measure. In their wildness, we see not primitive excess, but profoundly human responses to circumstances we can barely imagine. They celebrated wildly because they lived desperately, and in their desperation they found ways to create moments of transcendent joy that carried them through the darkness. Sleep well tonight, grateful for the abundance that surrounds you. And remember those who came before, whose wild celebrations were born not of plenty, but of the courage to find joy in the midst of unimaginable hardship. Looking at the script summary you've provided and the reference materials, I'll continue from where part 1 left off. Focusing on the deeper psychological and social drivers behind medieval festival wildness. However, the true wildness of medieval festivals wasn't just about food and drink. It was about something far more primal and necessary for human survival in those brutal times. These celebrations served as crucial psychological pressure valves in a world where death lurked around every corner and hope was often the only currency that mattered. Consider the sheer mental toll of medieval existence. Imagine waking each morning knowing that a single bad harvest could mean watching your children starve. Picture living through winter after winter where the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially lethal. Think about the constant awareness that disease could sweep through your village at any moment, claiming half the population before anyone understood why. This wasn't the kind of stress we experience today, worrying about deadlines or social media notifications. This was existential terror day after day, year after year. The human psyche simply cannot sustain that level of chronic anxiety without some form of release. And that's exactly what medieval festivals provided. A sanctioned opportunity to temporarily abandon the crushing weight of reality. The Feast of Fools, celebrated around New Year's, perfectly exemplified this psychological necessity. For a few precious days, the entire social order was deliberately turned upside down. Peasants mocked their lords, servants commanded their masters, and the lowest members of society were crowned as temporary kings. Church services became theatrical performances where sacred hymns were replaced with bawdy songs, and solemn prayers became comedic parodies. But this wasn't just harmless fun. This was a carefully orchestrated release of social tensions that might otherwise explode into genuine rebellion. The ruling classes understood, perhaps instinctively, that allowing people to symbolically overthrow the system for a few days actually helped preserve that system for the rest of the year. It was a brilliant, if unconscious, form of social engineering. The wildness went beyond mere role reversal. During these festivals, behaviors that would normally result in severe punishment became not just acceptable, but encouraged. Public drunkenness, sexual impropriety, acts of minor vandalism, even mock violence, all were temporarily permitted. People who spent their lives bowing and scraping to authority figures suddenly found themselves free to express rage, frustration, and desires they normally had to suppress. Take the medieval carnival traditions that preceded Lent. These weren't quaint parades with colorful floats, or frenzied celebrations where masked revelers engaged in activities that bordered on the anarchic. Sexual boundaries dissolved as people hid behind elaborate disguises. Gambling, normally restricted or forbidden, became widespread. Mock trials were held where unpopular authority figures were symbolically executed. Effigies of hated nobles or corrupt clergy were paraded through streets before being burned or torn apart by cheering crowds. The psychological release was so intense that people would travel for days just to participate in these festivals. Entire villages would empty out as residents. Journey to larger towns where the celebrations were more elaborate and the anonymity more complete. They would spend precious resources they could barely afford, sell livestock, or trade items they desperately needed. All for the chance to experience a few days of psychological freedom. But the wildness wasn't random or chaotic. It followed specific patterns and rules, almost like a ritual dance of madness. The celebrations had distinct phases, building from relatively tame activities to increasingly extreme behaviors, then gradually winding down as reality reasserted itself. This structured wildness served multiple psychological functions. First, it provided a safe container for dangerous emotions. Rather than letting anger and frustration build until they exploded unpredictably, festivals channeled these feelings into predetermined outlets. People could scream, fight, and destroy things, but within limits that prevented genuine social collapse. Second, it created powerful bonding experiences. Shared transgression, even temporary and sanctioned transgression, creates deep social bonds. When you've gotten drunk together, broken rules together, and engaged in forbidden behaviors together, you develop connections that transcend normal social boundaries. Peasants who might normally be suspicious of neighbors from other villages found themselves united in temporary brotherhood. Third, it reinforced social hierarchies even while appearing to challenge them by making the overthrow of authority temporary and theatrical. Festivals actually emphasized how permanent and natural the normal order was supposed to be. When the celebrations ended and everyone returned to their proper places, the contrast made those positions seem even more fixed and inevitable. The religious calendar itself was designed around this need for psychological release. The Church, despite its often stern moral teachings, recognized that human nature required outlets for impulses that couldn't be entirely suppressed. So they created a rhythm of restriction and release, fasting and feasting, penance and celebration. Lent's 40 days of deprivation made Easter's feast that much more meaningful. Advent solemnity made Christmas revelry feel truly liberating. Even the timing of festivals reflected deep psychological understanding. The darkest, coldest months were when people needed hope and warmth most desperately. So winter celebrations like Christmas, Twelfth Night, and Candlemas provided light and heat and community exactly when isolation and despair threatened to overwhelm the population. Summer festivals like midsummer and harvest celebrations came when people had energy to spare and reasons to be grateful. The wildness also served as a form of collective therapy for trauma. Medieval people lived with levels of violence and suffering that would be considered intolerable today. Why life was harsh for medieval miners. History for sleep despite all these hardships. Mining continued to expand throughout the medieval period, driven by the growing demand for metals and coal. The human cost of this expansion was enormous, but it was a cost that society seemed willing to bear. So long as it was borne primarily by the poorest and most vulnerable members of the population, the miners themselves had little choice but to continue their dangerous work. These glimpses reveal lives of extraordinary hardship and remarkable resilience of men who faced impossible odds with a determination that speaks to the fundamental human capacity for endurance. Trapped by economic necessity and the lack of viable alternatives, the stories of individual miners like Edmund were rarely recorded. Their lives and deaths noted only in the crude records kept by mine owners to track their workforce. But occasionally, fragments of their experiences survive in legal documents, church records, or the accounts of visitors to mining areas. It's worth remembering Edmund and the countless men like him, who paid such a terrible price for the metals and fuel that built medieval civilization. But their stories remind us of how far we have come and how much we owe to those who came before us, toiling in darkness so that we might live in the light, and remembering that our modern comforts were built upon foundations laid by hands that never knew the luxury of safety or security. As we drift off to sleep in our comfortable beds warmed by heating systems that pose no threat to our safety in breathing air, that we take for granted as clean and safe, but their struggles extended far beyond the confines of the underground tunnels. The very communities these miners called home were shaped by the harsh realities of their profession, creating a cycle of hardship that touched every aspect of their lives. Their sacrifices were largely unrecognized in their own time, their suffering seen as simply the natural order of things. The medieval miner's tale is one of human endurance in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds of communities, bound together by shared hardship and of the terrible cost of progress measured in human lives. As the night settles around us and we close our eyes, we can honor their memory by acknowledging their struggles. In their silent courage and stubborn persistence, we find a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit in the darkest and most dangerous of places. Part 4, as we've seen. The daily existence of medieval miners like Edmund was fraught with immediate physical dangers and health hazards. Picture the mining settlements that dotted the medieval landscape. These were not the picturesque villages we might imagine from fairy tales, but grimy. Soot-covered clusters of ramshackle dwellings built around the gaping mouths of mine shafts. The walls, built from whatever materials could be scrounged locally, offered little protection against the bitter winds that swept across the exposed mining sites. Windows were small and few, partly to conserve heat, but also because glass was a luxury far beyond most miners' means. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the ordinary minersmen like Edmund, who descended into the earth each day with nothing but their strength and determination to sustain them, and their agentsmen who rarely, if ever, set foot underground, but who controlled every aspect of the miners' lives. Miners were typically paid by the amount of coal or they extracted a system that encouraged dangerous shortcuts and reckless speed. A cabin that blocked a tunnel meant no pay for the miners who had been working that section. Regardless of whether the collapse was due to their actions or simply the inherent instability of the workings, these wealthy landowners lived in grand houses well away from the mining sites, their comfort built quite literally on the backs of the men who toiled in the darkness below. This economic vulnerability created a climate of fear that permeated every aspect of miners' lives. Education was virtually unknown in these communities, as there were no schools and no teachers willing to work in such remote and impoverished locations. While they might avoid the immediate physical dangers of underground work, they faced a lifetime of domestic drudgery in the coal-stained hovels of the mining community. Marriage to another miner was often their only escape from their parents' home, but it merely meant trading one form of hardship for another. Most children began working in the mines as soon as they were physically capable, starting with simple tasks like carrying water or tending to the ponies that hauled coal cars through the tunnels. The constant stooping and crouching led to permanent spinal deformities, while the repetitive motion of swinging picks caused severe joint damage. Thomas's shoulders ached constantly. and his back had developed a permanent hunch that marked him as clearly as any brand. By their teenage years, they would be working alongside their fathers in the deepest and most dangerous parts of the mines. Located far from major towns and cities, these settlements were cut off from the broader currents of medieval life. News traveled slowly, if at all, and the miners had little knowledge of events beyond their immediate surroundings. This isolation made it easier for mine owners to maintain their control, as workers had few alternatives and little understanding of conditions elsewhere. A man who complained too loudly about unsafe conditions might find himself blacklisted from work, unable to feed his family. Those who attempted to organize their fellow workers faced even harsher consequences. The authorities viewed any collective action by miners as a threat to the established order, and they were quick to use violence to suppress even the mildest protest. They viewed their workers as little more than expendable resources, easily replaced when injury or death claimed another victim. Above them were the skilled craftsmen who maintained the equipment and supervised the more dangerous operations. These men commanded slightly better wages and marginally safer working conditions. Though they were still far from comfortable by any measure, instead, oiled cloth or wooden shutters kept out the worst of the elements, though they also kept out much of the precious daylight. The air itself seemed permanently stained with coal dust, settling on everything like a fine black snow that never melted. Most families grew what food they could in small garden plots, supplementing their meager diet with whatever they could forage from the surrounding countryside. Hunting was often forbidden. The land typically belonged to the mine owners or local nobility, who jealously guarded their exclusive rights to the game. Coal dust clung to every surface, worked its way into clothing and bedding, and left its mark on the faces and hands of every family member. No amount of scrubbing could completely remove the black stains that seemed to seep into the very pores of the skin. The miners' wives spent countless hours trying to keep their homes clean, but it was a losing battle against the ever-present dust that drifted in from the nearby workings. Children grew up breathing this tainted atmosphere, their lungs darkening before they could even speak their first words. The miners' homes were modest affairs at best, often little more than single-room structures, where entire families huddled together for warmth. Inside these humble dwellings, the evidence of the miner's profession was everywhere. The social structure of these mining communities reflected the broader inequalities of medieval society, but with its own particular harsh edges. At the top of the local social order were the mine owners. The economic relationship between miners and their employers was brutally simple and utterly one-sided. There were no compensation schemes for injured workers, no support for the widows and children of men killed in mining accidents. The isolation of mining communities made their situation even more precarious. Trade was virtually non-existent in these communities. As the miners had little to offer beyond their labor and even less money to spend on goods from outside, the children of miners faced a particularly bleak future. For the daughters of miners, the options were even more limited. The physical toll of mining work was devastating. Men worked in cramped conditions, often crawling on their hands and knees through passages barely wide enough for a human body. The rock dust that filled the air with every blow of the pick was perhaps the most insidious threat of all. This fine particulate matter coated the miners' lungs, building up over months and years until breathing became a labored struggle. The wooden supports that held up tunnel ceilings were often inadequate for the weight of rock and earth above. These supports would rot in the damp conditions, simply snap under excessive pressure, bringing tons of stone crashing down without warning. Thomas had been trapped by smaller cave-ins on 3 separate occasions, once spending 8 hours pinned beneath fallen timbers, while rescue crews dug frantically to reach him. The condition later known as pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease, was virtually universal among miners who survived long enough to develop it. Minor cuts and bruises were treated with whatever folk remedies were available, herbs, poultices, and prayers. Mining settlements were often located in remote areas near the mineral deposits, far from larger towns and cities. This isolation meant that miners and their families had little contact with the outside world and few opportunities for economic advancement or social mobility. The mining camps themselves were rough, lawless places where violence and desperation were commonplace. More serious injuries often meant permanent disability or death. A broken leg in a mine collapse might heal crooked, leaving a man unable to work. They had to cope with the constant uncertainty of whether their husbands and sons would return home each evening. They were used as trappers, sitting alone in dark tunnels for hours at a time, opening and closing ventilation doors as minecarts passed through. These children developed rickets from lack of sunlight, suffered from malnutrition, and often died from accidents or exposure to toxic gases. Education was virtually non-existent in mining communities, trapping families in cycles of poverty and dangerous work. Many became widows at young ages, left to raise children in poverty with few options for support. Some women worked at the surface of mines, sorting or operating primitive washing equipment, exposing them to many of the same health hazards as the men below ground. Burns from mine fires frequently became infected, leading to slow, agonizing deaths from blood poisoning. The miners had no understanding of antiseptics or proper wound care, and many died from injuries that would be easily treatable today. Thomas could hear it in his own breathing. The wet, rattling sound that grew worse each month, the shortness of breath that came with even mild exertion. Cave-ins were a constant terror that haunted every miner's thoughts. The psychological impact of such constant danger was profound. Many miners developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorders. They would start at sudden sounds, have nightmares about being buried alive, and some simply refused to enter the mines again. Choosing poverty over the daily terror of underground work, the mines had a way of breaking men's spirits long before they broke their bodies. Miners typically worked from dawn until dusk with only brief breaks for meager meals. In winter, this meant descending into the earth in darkness and emerging in darkness, going weeks without seeing natural sunlight. The combination of long hours, dangerous conditions, and poor nutrition left miners exhausted and vulnerable to accidents. Many injuries occurred late in the day, when fatigue clouded judgment and slowed reaction times. Safety equipment was virtually non-existent in medieval mining operations. Miners worked without helmets, relying only on cloth caps that provided no protection against falling rocks. They had no safety ropes or harnesses when working near vertical shafts, no breathing apparatus to filter out deadly dust and gases, no protective eyewear to shield their vision from flying stone chips. A miner's only protection was his experience, his quick reflexes, and whatever divine providence might watch over him in the depths. The work schedule in medieval mines was brutal and unforgiving. Medical care for injured miners was primitive and often ineffective. The social isolation experienced by mining communities was particularly harsh. Women in mining communities faced their own set of challenges. While they typically did not work underground, they were responsible for maintaining households under extremely difficult conditions. Children in mining families often began working at very young ages, sometimes as early as 7 or 8 years old. Imagine being so poor that you must work 12 hours a day just to stay alive. Now imagine doing this dangerous work without any safety equipment and knowing that if you get hurt, you'll be out of work and probably die. They dug tunnels by hand and carried heavy loads without any modern tools or safety equipment. If they made one wrong move, they could be crushed by falling rocks or poisoned by toxic gases. But despite the danger, miners kept working because they had no other choice. And dust, where deadly gases fill the streets, and where you can't even drink water without getting sick. Welcome to the reality of a medieval mining town. These places were a nightmare, not just for the miners, but for everyone around them. You see, mining released dangerous substances into the air, water, and soil, polluting everything around them. He was a typical person of his time, but his job made him a bit different. Back then, average people weren't very tall, and miners especially didn't get much sun. His skin would be dark from working inside the mine, and his hair and eyes were probably a darker color too, like a lot of people back then. Overall, Thomas wouldn't look too different from other folks in his town. They also hung out at the local pub, playing games, drinking, and socializing. It was a chance to relax and forget about the dangers of mining. Sometimes Thomas and his friends went to religious services for comfort and hope for a better life. They believed in God and prayed for help in hard times. Religion was important to them and gave them strength to keep going. Despite these setbacks, the contributions of miners during the medieval period should not be overlooked. Their hard work and dedication played a vital role in shaping the economic and technological advancements of the era. By exploring the lives of medieval miners, We gain a deeper understanding of the complexities and challenges of early industrial work and the impact it had on society as a whole. He'd probably have a simple hairstyle and no fancy jewelry. What do you admire about their resilience and determination? Share your thoughts below, and let's have a discussion. And if you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about medieval life, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. They supported each other, found joy in everyday life, and believed in a higher purpose. Even in tough situations, they stayed hopeful for a better future. One such example is the rise of miners who dedicated their lives to extracting valuable resources from the earth. However, this profession came with significant challenges and sacrifices. Miners often endured harsh working conditions, limited access to education, and frequent workplace accidents. Despite these hardships, mining played a crucial role in fueling the growth of medieval economies and supporting various industries such as metalworking and glassmaking. Moreover, the demand for minerals used in construction and decoration contributed to the expansion of mining operations across Europe. As mining became increasingly important, entire communities sprung up around mines, creating self-sufficient settlements that relied on the extraction and processing of minerals. These mining towns often had their own housing, shops, and schools, providing miners and their families with a sense of community and belonging. However, life in these towns was not without its challenges, as residents had to contend with issues such as poverty, crime, and environmental degradation. Miners weren't known for being stylish, and they didn't have much time for that anyway. Their story helps us understand where we are today. But there's one thing that would make Thomas stand out. He'd probably wear a badge showing who owned his soul. Okay, I'm kidding. It wouldn't be a literal badge. But back then, miners usually worked for a certain company, and they had to show papers proving it. These papers were like their identity, and they had to show them all the time. It was a way to control the miners and make sure they did and cause trouble or try to switch jobs. Let's start with his appearance. He probably wore simple clothes, maybe a tunic and a hooded cloak. Work clothes weren't fancy, just practical. He probably woke up before sunrise to get ready for work. After a quick breakfast, he grabbed his pickaxe and headed to the mine. He'd walk past other miners and their families, and they'd chat about their day. Then it was time to work. Thomas and the other miners split up and went to different parts of the mine. They used their picks to break rocks and separate the valuable parts. The work was hard and dangerous, but they had to do it quickly and carefully. One wrong move could mean serious injury. Since miners got dirty all the time, they didn't have many nice clothes anyway. The miners sat down, ate whatever they brought, and rested a bit. Some told stories or jokes to pass the time, and it was back to work until it was time to go home. When Thomas finished work, he joined the other miners walking home. They talked about their day or local news and joked around. Then they went home to rest and eat dinner with their families. Sometimes they invited friends over and told stories late into the night. Life was hard, but they had each other. Thomas's hands would be rough and strong from carrying heavy stuff, and his face and lungs would be dusty from working in the mines. Also, miners usually had a pickaxe strapped to their belt, which was their main tool for digging. They also carried a lamp to light the way, and a water bucket to keep things cool and wet, which helped prevent explosions. Sometimes they even brought a hammer and a gun to blast rocks. Rivers turned black, and people got sick from drinking water. Birds and animals disappeared, and crops failed to grow. Mining basically destroyed everything in its path, making it hard for anyone to survive. Most of them were too poor to buy equipment, and skilled labor was always in demand. Miners looked out for each other while working, helping each other carry heavy loads or sharing food when there wasn't enough to go around. And even though the community tried to help, there was only so much they could do. They even comforted each other after accidents, helping the families of those who died. These communities created their own culture with special songs and stories, kind of like a way to deal with the danger and sadness around them. Plus, if they didn't work, they wouldn't eat. This wasn't a scene from a movie. It was everyday life for a medieval miner like Thomas. They were basically prisoners in their own little town, where everything was controlled by the mine owner. Miners often worked for dangerous, greedy mine owners who didn't care about their safety. If a miner got hurt, he would just get fired. No hospital, no pay, nothing. Then some poor guy, desperate for money, would take his place. In fact, there were so few laws protecting miners that if you accused your boss of mistreatment, you could to get arrested for slander. These guys really took advantage of miners' desperate situation, set the rules, and everyone had to follow them. For example, he decided how much miners got paid and what they could buy with that money. And let me tell you, it wasn't much. In fact, most miners earned so little, they couldn't even afford basic supplies like food or clothing. So instead of paying them with real money, mine owners gave them something called company scrip. This was basically fake money that could only be spent at the company store. But here's the catch. Those stores charged crazy high prices, like 300% more than regular stores. So even if you had a lot of this fake money, you couldn't buy much with it. Basically, miners were trapped in a never-ending cycle of debt. They couldn't save up enough money to buy their freedom, because the system was rigged against them. In the Middle Ages, miners worked in extremely dangerous conditions. These medieval mine workers weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. It's worse. Wait, it gets even worse. Imagine living in a town where the air is thick with smoke. But despite all this, mining towns were usually pretty close-knit. People had to stick together to survive. But don't be fooled. Life in these mining towns was super tough. Families argued and sometimes broke apart. Now let's talk about Thomas, an average medieval miner. As for his looks, Thomas was probably short for his time, around 4 feet 11 inches. Now, let's talk about Thomas's daily life. For a few hours, it was time for lunch. When Thomas and other miners weren't working, they did other stuff like fixing their homes, taking care of animals, or growing crops. Even though medieval miners' jobs were dangerous and pay was low, they had some good times too. So next time you use a computer or drive a car, think about miners like Thomas, who worked hard and sometimes died to bring technology to life. The medieval period witnessed the emergence of specialized labor, which had profound implications for society. As the Middle Ages progressed, mining techniques and safety measures gradually improved. But workplace accidents and health problems continued to plague miners. So now I want to ask you, how do you think medieval miners managed to endure such difficult working conditions? They witnessed public executions, saw children die from preventable diseases, experienced starvation and warfare as regular occurrences. These experiences left deep psychological scars that had no individual outlets for healing. Festivals provided a communal space for processing trauma. Through ritual reenactments, symbolic dramas, and shared expressions of grief and rage, communities could collectively work through experiences that would otherwise remain as festering psychological wounds. The apparent wildness was actually a sophisticated form of emotional healing. Consider how death was incorporated into festival celebrations. Rather than hiding from mortality, medieval festivals often featured elaborate dances of death, where people dressed as skeletons and corpses. These weren't morbid obsessions, but healthy acknowledgments of life's fragility. By confronting death symbolically and communally, people could process their constant fear of mortality in ways that made it more manageable. The festivals also provided crucial opportunities for hope and dreaming. During celebrations, people told stories of better times, sang songs about heroes who overcame impossible odds, participated in rituals that promised better harvests, successful hunts, or protection from disease. These weren't just entertainment. They were psychological survival tools that helped people maintain the hope necessary to continue living in desperate circumstances. Even the apparent excess and waste of festivals served important psychological functions. In a world defined by scarcity, the ability to be deliberately wasteful, even briefly, was a powerful assertion of human agency. When people spent their last coins on festival treats or burned valuable wood in huge bonfires, they were declaring that they were more than mere survival machines. They had desires and dreams that transcended basic necessity. The communal nature of festival wildness was crucial. Individual madness was dangerous and often led to social exclusion or worse. But collective wildness, shared wildness, was healing and bonding. When everyone participated in breaking normal rules together, no one person bore the burden of transgression alone. The psychological relief was distributed across the entire community, making it safer and more manageable for everyone involved. This is why medieval festivals were so wild. Not because people were primitive or lacked self-control, but because they had developed sophisticated, if unconscious, methods for managing the psychological pressures of an almost unbearably difficult existence. The wildness was wisdom. The excess was necessity, and the apparent madness was actually a form of collective sanity that kept entire societies from breaking apart under impossible strain. Understanding this helps us see medieval festivals not as quaint historical curiosities or examples of past barbarism, but as remarkable achievements of human adaptability. These celebrations represent our ancestors. Brilliant solutions to psychological and social challenges that would have destroyed less resilient communities. Their wildness was their strength, their excess was their survival, and their temporary madness was what kept them permanently sane. Looking at your script so far and the reference materials, I can see you've established a strong foundation about medieval festivals as sophisticated coping mechanisms for desperate times. Here's part 3, continuing from where you left off. But these wild celebrations served another crucial function that historians often overlook. They were elaborate training grounds for social rebellion. During the Feast of Fools, when peasants mocked bishops and serfs commanded lords, something profound was happening beneath the surface of apparent chaos. These weren't just random acts of defiance. They were carefully choreographed rehearsals for revolution. Consider the elaborate mock trials that took place during carnival season. Peasants would drag effigies of unpopular nobles through the streets, conducting satirical court proceedings that laid bare every grievance, every injustice, every abuse of power they'd endured throughout the year. To the casual observer, this might have seemed like harmless theater. But these performances were teaching ordinary people something revolutionary: that authority figures could be questioned, ridiculed, and ultimately overthrown. The psychological impact was staggering. For most of the year, a peasant would never dare look a lord in the eye, let alone speak against him. The social hierarchy was as rigid as stone, enforced by brutal punishment and divine mandate. But during festival season, these same peasants discovered they possessed voices, loud, angry, articulate voices, that could reduce the mighty two objects of mockery. They learned that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, could be stripped away through collective action and shared courage. This training in rebellion wasn't accidental. Medieval festivals evolved sophisticated techniques for building group solidarity and testing the waters of resistance. The Chariari, those raucous processions where communities would bang pots and pans outside the homes of wrongdoers, taught participants how to coordinate mass action, how to maintain anonymity within a crowd, and how to apply sustained pressure until their target submitted. These weren't just noise-making sessions. They were masterclasses in grassroots organizing. The symbolic language of these festivals was equally subversive. When peasants crowned a lord of misrule, they weren't just playing dress-up. They were experimenting with alternative power structures. They were asking dangerous questions. What if leadership came from below instead of above? What if merit mattered more than birthright? What if the natural order wasn't so natural after all? These weren't abstract philosophical debates. They were practical exercises in imagining a different world. But perhaps most importantly, medieval festivals taught people that change was possible. In a society where everything seemed permanent and divinely ordained, where your station in life felt carved in stone by God himself, the very act of transformation, even temporary transformation, was revolutionary. When a beggar could become a king for a day, when a fool could speak, wisdom to power, when the last could become first, people began to understand that the world was far more malleable than their rulers wanted them to believe. The timing of these festivals was no coincidence either. They typically occurred during periods of maximum social stress. A woman who had played the role of an abbess during a religious party might find herself later organizing female laborers in her village. A young man who had led a festival procession might emerge as a natural leader during times of genuine crisis. The festivals were creating leaders, organizers, and revolutionaries without anyone fully realizing it. The authorities certainly didn't understand what they were witnessing. To them, these festivals looked like harmless chaos, a way for the common people to blow off steam before returning to their proper places. They saw drunken revelry and crude humor, not political education. They observed temporary disorder, not systematic preparation for permanent change. This blindness to the festival as true power was perhaps their greatest gift to the revolutionary movements that would follow. The festivals also taught people crucial lessons about solidarity and mutual aid. During these celebrations, communities came together to pool resources, share food, support their most vulnerable members. Wealthy merchants might find themselves obligated by festival tradition to provide free bread to the poor. Nobles might be expected to open their cellars and share their wine with commoners. These weren't just generous gestures, they were practical lessons in redistribution that planted seeds for future demands for economic justice. Perhaps most importantly, the festivals demonstrated that alternative ways of organizing society were not only possible, but could be genuinely joyful. This was revolutionary in itself. The dominant narrative of medieval society insisted that hierarchy was necessary. Without strict social order, there would be only chaos and suffering. But during festivals, people experienced the opposite. They found that when power was shared, when wealth was redistributed, when traditional roles were abandoned, the result wasn't chaos, but celebration. The psychological impact of these experiences cannot be overstated. For people who had been told their entire lives that they were naturally inferior, that their poverty was God's will, that their suffering was necessary for social stability, the festivals provided powerful counter-evidence. They showed that joy and abundance were possible, that leadership could emerge from unexpected places, that communities could govern themselves effectively without constant oversight from their supposed betters. These lessons were reinforced through repetition. Festivals weren't once-in-a-lifetime events, but annual occurrences that allowed people to practice and refine their organizing skills. Each year, the temporary governments became more sophisticated, the role reversals more elaborate, the challenges to authority more pointed. What began as crude parodies evolved into sophisticated critiques of existing power structures. The festivals also created lasting bonds between participants that extended far beyond the celebration itself. When you've shared in the planning of a massive community event, when you've worked together to create elaborate costumes and decorations, when you've collectively challenged authority figures and lived to tell the tale, you've formed relationships that can sustain you through difficult times. These networks of mutual support became the foundation for resistance movements that would emerge when festivals alone were no longer sufficient to address people's grievances. The geographic spread of festival traditions meant that these organizing skills were being developed simultaneously across vast areas. A peasant who learned leadership skills during harvest festivals in England might share techniques with a craftsman who had organized carnival celebrations in France. Traveling performers, merchants, and pilgrims carried festival innovations from town to town, creating a cross-cultural exchange of resistance techniques that authorities were powerless to stop. The festivals also served as testing grounds for new ideas about governance and social organization. During these temporary reversals, communities experimented with different ways of making decisions, resolving conflicts, and distributing resources. Some of these experiments worked better than others, but all provided valuable lessons that could be applied in more serious contexts. When real political crises emerged, communities had a repertoire of organizational models to draw upon, tested through years of festival practice. The cumulative effect of all this festival-based education was profound. By the late medieval period, European peasants possessed organizational skills and revolutionary consciousness that would have been unimaginable centuries earlier. They understood how to coordinate large-scale actions, how to challenge authority effectively, how to maintain solidarity under pressure, and how to envision alternative social arrangements. When the time came for serious rebellion, they were ready. The great irony is that the very authorities who permitted and even encouraged these festivals were inadvertently training their own opposition. By allowing these temporary inversions as safety valves for social pressure, they were actually creating the conditions for more fundamental challenges to their power. The festivals they thought were preventing revolution were actually making revolution possible. This dynamic helps explain why the late medieval and early modern periods saw such an explosion of popular uprisings. But in the end, there's no avoiding the brutal reality. Medieval festivals were wild. They were loud, messy affairs filled with drinking, dancing, singing, feasting, fighting, sometimes even rioting and lawlessness. Or when particularly brutal years of taxation and warfare left everyone demoralized and exhausted. During these difficult times, the authorities understood that something needed to give. Most people just had fun during these festivals, enjoying a break from the seriousness of everyday life. But some people, especially the organizers and leaders of the festivities, carried these lessons about collective action and social change into the rest of their lives. They became active members of local guilds and associations, working to improve conditions for everyone. But people found ways to make the best of it, to find humor and joy in the darkest of times. They were also a way of coping with the challenges of living in a medieval society. These wild men represented a rejection of the social norms and expectations of medieval life. They were a reminder that there were other ways of being in the world, other ways of living and behaving. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, please subscribe. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, the Middle Ages were a lot more fun than you might think. Their raucous laughter and their chaotic energy challenged the solemnity and the seriousness of everyday life. Medieval society was hierarchical and rigid. There were clear divisions between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, the noble and the commoner. They were a way for people to cope with the challenges of medieval life. A chance to find joy and laughter in a sometimes bleak and unforgiving world. They were a way to challenge authority and question the status quo. They were a training ground for revolution. These festivals may seem like a quaint and distant part of our past, but they remind us of the power of laughter and play to challenge the seriousness of power and the importance of community and solidarity in the face of adversity. There were laws and customs that governed everything from what they could wear to what they could eat. There was little room for individuality or self-expression, but during these festivals, people could shed their everyday identities and take on new ones. They could dress up as kings and queens or peasants and farmers. They could laugh at the seriousness of authority or mock the hypocrisy of the elite. They could be whoever they wanted to be without fear of reprisal. Festivals like Carnival, Easter, and Christmas provided an escape from the drudgery of everyday life, a chance to let loose and have some fun. People dressed up in costumes, danced and sang, drank and partied. They told stories and played games. They put on plays and performances. They celebrated life, and they mocked the seriousness of everyday life. It was a time for laughter, for joy, for community. They participated in local politics, advocating for change and reform. In some cases, they even helped organize full-blown rebellions and uprisings, overthrowing unjust rulers and establishing new forms of government. So they allowed or even encouraged these celebrations as pressure release valves to let off some steam. They were focused on the immediate effects on how the festivals relieved social tensions and prevented bigger problems down the road. Plus, they probably figured that most people just had fun at these festivals and didn't take any deeper lessons away from them. But that wasn't entirely true. Many people did take something away from these celebrations, a sense of their own power, their own ability to shape their world. To relieve social tensions that could otherwise boil over into real trouble, some of the most significant rebellions and revolutions in medieval Europe happened in places where these festivals had been most popular and widespread. For example, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England didn't erupt from nowhere. It bubbled up from communities that had spent generations participating in these festivals, learning how to organize, how to communicate grievances, and how to act collectively. The leaders of these revolts weren't trained military commanders or professional revolutionaries. They were people who had learned how to speak to crowds during Carnival, who understood how to use symbolic language from years of festival participation, who knew how to coordinate mass action from countless charivar processions. Even the geography of rebellion followed festival patterns. Revolts typically began in towns and villages with the strongest festival traditions. Spreading along the same networks that carried carnival celebrations from community to community, the rebels used the same meeting places, the same communication methods, and often the same symbolic vocabulary that had been developed during decades of apparently harmless merrymaking. This wasn't lost on the authorities once they finally understood what was happening. By the late medieval period, we see increasingly desperate attempts to control and limit festival activities. Laws were passed, restricting the size of gatherings, banning certain types of performances, and requiring official permits for celebrations. The very wildness that had once been tolerated, even encouraged as a safety valve, was now recognized as a mortal threat to the established order. But by then it was too late. The damage was done. Generations of peasants had learned that they possessed power. Collective power that could challenge kings and topple kingdoms. They had discovered that the elaborate pageantry of medieval authority was just as artificial and performative as their own festival celebrations. Once that knowledge took root, once people understood that power structures were human creations rather than divine mandates, the medieval world was doomed. The wild nature of these festivals, then, wasn't just about releasing tension or maintaining social bonds. It was about something far more dangerous. It was about ordinary people discovering their own agency, their own voice, their own capacity to reshape the world around them. Every mock coronation was a lesson in the arbitrariness of real power. Every satirical performance was a masterclass in speaking truth to authority. Every moment of chaos was a glimpse of a world where the rules could be rewritten. How did such boisterous, unruly celebrations ever become part of medieval life? Why did authorities allow or even encourage these seemingly out-of-control events? Along with all the revelry and merriment, these festivals were also teaching people valuable lessons about their own power and agency. People learned that through collective action, through getting together and acting in unison, they could make a difference. They could influence how things were run. They could bring about positive change in their communities. Think about those mock elections we talked about in part 2. Sure, they were a lot of fun. Everyone loved a good election. They also taught people that power wasn't absolute, that even authority figures could be replaced with someone else if enough people wanted it. Those mock trials during the Festival of Fools might have seemed like a joke, but they also showed people that legal authority could be challenged, that laws weren't set in stone, that even judges and officials could be held accountable. What if real trials were less fair than these fake ones? What if real laws could be changed to be more equitable? All of these ideas might have started as jokes, but they had real-world consequences. And how did medieval people experience these festivals, and what did they mean for their lives? To answer these questions, we need to understand the forces that shaped these celebrations, and how they evolved over time. It all started after the winters were harsh and unforgiving. Food stores ran low and people's tempers ran high. But here's the thing. Now, this isn't to say that everyone suddenly started questioning everything they'd been taught. That's not how it worked. The authorities didn't really recognize this aspect of the festivals, this idea that they were somehow training people for larger acts of resistance. The evidence for this is written in blood across medieval history. Medieval festivals were also a way for people to cope with the hardships of life. Life during the Middle Ages was tough. There were famines, diseases, and wars. But these festivals weren't just about escaping from the seriousness of everyday life. For example, during the Festival of Fools, people would dress up as hairy wild men and storm through the streets, roaring and making mischief. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, medieval festivals were a lot more than just parties. And there you have it, another journey into the heart of medieval life. The Peasants' Revolt, the German Peasants' War, the various urban rebellions across Europe. All of these drew upon organizational traditions and revolutionary ideas that had been nurtured in festival settings for generations. The wild celebrations that seemed so harmless to contemporary observers were actually forging the weapons that would eventually threaten the entire medieval order. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about medieval festivals. They were simultaneously conservative and revolutionary, stabilizing and destabilizing, supporting the existing order while preparing its transformation. They provided just enough release to prevent immediate explosion, while building the capacity for eventual revolution. They were safety valves that were also pressure cookers, creating exactly the conditions they were meant to prevent. In the end, the wildness of medieval festivals wasn't just about excess or desperation or temporary escape from harsh realities. It was about learning, growing, preparing, and dreaming. It was about discovering that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they acted together. It was about recognizing that the world could be different, should be different, and might someday actually become different. The festivals were wild because they were dangerous, not just to individual dignity or social propriety, but to the entire structure of medieval society itself. Here's part 5 of why medieval festivals were so wild, continuing from where the previous parts left off. But perhaps nowhere was this revolutionary potential more visible than in the actual structure of medieval festivals themselves. These weren't simply chaotic free-for-alls, though they might have appeared that way to outside observers. Instead, they operated according to their own sophisticated logic. their own alternative social contracts that demonstrated just how differently society could be organized. Take the Feast of Fools celebrated throughout much of medieval Europe during the Christmas season. This wasn't merely drunken revelry, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was a systematic inversion of the entire social order. It's carried out with theatrical precision that would make modern performance artists weep with envy. During these festivals, the lowest-ranking clerics would elect a mock bishop or pope from among their number. This festival leader would then proceed to conduct elaborate parodies of sacred rituals, delivering sermons that mock church doctrine, blessing the crowd with sausages instead of holy water, and leading processions, where sacred hymns were replaced with bawdy drinking songs. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. These weren't random acts of sacrilege. They were carefully choreographed demonstrations of how power actually worked. When a lowly church janitor was crowned mock pope and began issuing ridiculous edicts that everyone had to follow, the crowd wasn't just laughing at the absurdity. They were learning, perhaps without even realizing it, that papal authority itself was just as arbitrary, just as performative, just as dependent on collective belief and participation. The mock pope would issue proclamations like "all debts are forgiven" or "the rich must serve the poor for one day." And while these were understood to be temporary jokes, they planted seeds of possibility in people's minds. What if debts really could be forgiven? What if the rich really could be made to serve? What if the entire social hierarchy really was just an elaborate performance that could be rewritten at will? This psychological preparation for revolution was even more explicit in festivals like the Roman Saturnalia, which persisted in various forms throughout the medieval period. During Saturnalia, masters literally served their slaves, taking orders and performing menial tasks, while their former servants lounged in luxury. For a few precious days, everyone got to experience life from the other side of the power dynamic. Slaves learned what it felt like to give orders and have them obeyed. Masters learned what it felt like to be at someone else's mercy. Now imagine you're a medieval serf who has just spent several days ordering your lord around, watching him stumble through tasks you perform effortlessly every day, seeing him sweat and strain and struggle with work he usually takes for granted. When the festival ends and the normal order returns, do you think you're going to view that lord's authority in quite the same way? Do you think his commands will carry the same weight of natural inevitability they once did? This is why these festivals were so much more than simple entertainment. They were training grounds for revolution. It's places where people could practice imagining and implementing alternative social arrangements. They provided crucial psychological preparation for the possibility that things could be different, that power structures weren't eternal and unchangeable natural laws, but rather human constructions that could be challenged, modified, or completely overthrown. The evidence for this revolutionary training can be found in the actual historical record of medieval uprisings. Time and again, we see that successful revolts followed the same patterns that had been rehearsed during festivals. Leaders emerged who had learned to command during festival role rehearsals. Organizational structures developed that mirrored the alternative hierarchies practiced during celebrations. Revolutionary rhetoric borrowed heavily from the satirical speeches and mock proclamations that had been refined through years of festival performance. Consider the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. One of the most successful medieval uprisings. The rebels didn't simply explode in random violence. They demonstrated sophisticated organizational capabilities, coordinating simultaneous actions across multiple counties, establishing clear chains of command and articulating specific political demands. Where did they learn these skills? Many historians point to the elaborate festival traditions that had been practicing. Exactly these kinds of mass coordination and alternative leadership structures for generations. The revolt's leader, Wat Tyler, wasn't some naturally gifted military genius who emerged from nowhere. He was a man who had spent years participating in festivals where common people practiced taking charge, making speeches, and organizing collective action. The rebels' ability to coordinate complex, multi-regional strategies wasn't supernatural. It was the result of decades of festival experiences that had taught them how to communicate across social and geographic boundaries, how to organize large groups of people, and how to sustain collective action over extended periods. Even more tellingly, the rebels' demands weren't just economic grievances about taxes and working conditions. They included sophisticated political concepts about equality, representation, and social justice that had been developed and refined through generations of festival discourse. When what Tyler demanded the abolition of serfdom and the establishment of equal rights for all people, he wasn't inventing revolutionary ideology on the spot. He was articulating ideas that had been percolating through festival culture for centuries. This pattern repeated itself throughout medieval Europe. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 drew heavily on festival traditions of mock trials and alternative justice systems. The Jacquerie in 14th century France utilized organizational structures that had been practiced during harvest festivals and village celebrations. Even failed revolts often demonstrated tactical sophistication and ideological coherence that could only have come from extensive prior practice. But festivals didn't just prepare people for dramatic armed rebellion. They also fostered the development of more subtle forms of resistance that chipped away at authoritarian power day by day. When people spent their festival time practicing solidarity, mutual aid, and collective decision-making, they carried those skills back into their everyday lives. Village communities that had learned to organize elaborate festivals found it easier to coordinate resistance to excessive taxation or unfair legal judgments. Workers who had practiced collective action during celebrations were better equipped to organize strikes or boycotts when their conditions became intolerable. Perhaps most importantly, festivals created what we might call revolutionary consciousness, a fundamental shift in how people understood their relationship to power and authority. When you've spent time in a community where decisions are made collectively, where resources are shared equitably, where everyone's voice carries equal weight, it becomes much harder to accept that inequality and oppression are natural or inevitable. You've tasted freedom, and that taste doesn't fade easily. This is why medieval authorities found themselves in such a complex position regarding festivals. On one hand, they recognized that these celebrations served as crucial pressure valves, allowing people to release frustrations and tensions that might otherwise explode into immediate violence. Banning festivals entirely risked triggering the very uprisings they were meant to prevent. But on the other hand, permitting festivals meant training their subjects in precisely the skills and consciousness that would enable successful revolution. Some rulers try to thread this needle by allowing limited controlled festivals, while suppressing the more obviously subversive elements. They might permit drinking and dancing, but ban satirical performances. They might allow role reversals within strict boundaries, while prohibiting any questioning of fundamental power structures. But these compromises often backfired, creating festivals that were unsatisfying enough to increase rather than decrease social tensions, while still providing enough revolutionary training to make uprisings more likely. Other authorities tried to co-opt festival energy by redirecting it toward approved targets. Instead of mocking local lords, festival participants might be encouraged to satirize foreign enemies or religious minorities, instead of practicing equality among themselves. They might be organized into elaborate displays of loyalty to the existing order. But these attempts at manipulation often failed as well, because the fundamental dynamics of festival consciousness raising were difficult to control once they were set in motion. The most successful medieval festivals from the perspective of fostering revolutionary potential were those that managed to maintain their independence from official control while avoiding direct confrontation that would trigger immediate suppression. These celebrations operated in a kind of parallel social space, acknowledging the existence of the official order while demonstrating that alternatives were possible. They were revolutionary schools disguised as parties, training centers for social transformation. Hidden in plain sight behind masks of harmless fun, its disguise was often quite literal. Medieval festivals featured extensive use of masks, costumes, and theatrical personas that allowed participants to experiment with different identities and social roles while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. A serf could spend an evening giving orders and making speeches while dressed as a mock king, then return to his regular duties the next day as if nothing had happened, but the psychological and social impact of that experience remained, gradually accumulating with similar experiences until it reached a critical mass that could fuel genuine revolutionary action. The wild nature of medieval festivals then wasn't just about releasing individual frustrations or indulging in temporary hedonism. It was about collectively imagining and practicing alternative ways of organizing society. It was about building the skills, relationships, and consciousness necessary for large-scale social transformation. It was about keeping alive the dangerous idea that the world didn't have to be the way it was, that ordinary people had the power to change it, and that such changes were not only possible, but potentially imminent. In this light, the apparent chaos and excess of medieval festivals reveals itself as something far more sophisticated and subversive than mere drunken revelry. These were carefully orchestrated exercises in revolutionary preparation, community-building projects designed to strengthen bonds between oppressed people while weakening their psychological attachment to oppressive systems. They discovered that effective leadership could emerge from their own ranks rather than being imposed from above. When real revolutionary moments arrived, these communities already possessed the organizational skills and leadership experience necessary for sustained resistance. The economic aspects of medieval festivals also challenged fundamental assumptions about property and wealth distribution. During these celebrations, normal economic rules were suspended. Wealthy merchants were expected to provide free food and drink. Lords opened their storehouses to feed the masses. Money changed hands freely, debts were forgiven, and resources were shared communally. This temporary redistribution of wealth gave peasants a tantalizing glimpse of a more equitable society. More importantly, these festivals demonstrated that alternative economic arrangements were possible. Communities discovered they could organize production, distribution, and consumption without the rigid hierarchies that normally governed medieval commerce. They learned to pool resources, coordinate labor, and share benefits in ways that challenged the fundamental premises of feudalism. When revolutionary movements later proposed radical changes to property relations, these ideas didn't seem impossible because festival experiences had already proven their viability. The religious dimensions of these festivals were equally subversive despite their apparent orthodoxy. Many celebrations incorporated elements of folk religion, ancient traditions, and pre-Christian beliefs that existed in tension with official church doctrine. This religious syncretism taught communities that spiritual authority was not monolithic, that alternative interpretations of divine will were possible, and that the church's monopoly on religious truth could be challenged. Festival rituals often inverted traditional religious hierarchies. Peasants dressed as bishops, conducted mock masses, and delivered satirical sermons that exposed clerical corruption and hypocrisy. These performances weren't mere entertainment. They were theological critiques that undermined the church's claims to moral authority. When later reform movements challenged church power, they built upon ideas and arguments that had been rehearsed for generations during festival celebrations. The artistic and cultural elements of medieval festivals also played crucial revolutionary roles. Songs, stories, plays, and performances created shared narratives that challenged official versions of history and social order. These cultural productions preserved memories of past resistances, celebrated folk heroes who had defied authority, imagined futures where justice prevailed over oppression. Festival art was inherently democratic because it emerged from and spoke to common experience rather than elite sensibilities. Unlike court literature or church art, which reinforced existing power structures, festival culture gave voice to popular aspirations and grievances. This cultural tradition provided revolutionary movements with powerful symbols, compelling narratives, and emotional frameworks that could mobilize mass support. The sheer scale and duration of medieval festivals also served important strategic purposes. These weren't brief, contained events, but extended celebrations that could last for days or even weeks. During this time, normal social and economic activity was suspended, creating space for alternative forms of organization to emerge and solidify. Communities had time to experiment with new leadership structures, practice collective decision on, and build the social bonds necessary for sustained resistance. The international character of many festivals also facilitated the spread of revolutionary ideas across political boundaries. Pilgrimage festivals, trade fairs, and religious celebrations brought together people from different regions, kingdoms, and social classes. These gatherings served as conferences where resistance strategies were shared. Alliances were formed, and coordinated actions were planned. The medieval festival circuit created a continental network that could rapidly disseminate revolutionary ideas and coordinate multi-renal uprisings. Perhaps most importantly, medieval festivals created what we might call revolutionary imagination. They showed communities that the world could be organized differently, that authority could be challenged, that hierarchy could be inverted, and that collective action could achieve seemingly impossible goals. This imaginative capacity was essential for revolutionary movements because it allowed people to envision, call alternatives to existing conditions, and believe that change was possible. Without this festivalgenated revolutionary imagination, medieval peasants might have remained trapped in cycles of resignation and despair. The festivals provided psychological proof that transformation was possible, that the powerful could be brought low, and that the meek could indeed inherit the earth. When real revolutionary opportunities arose, communities possessed not only the practical skills and organizational capacity necessary for resistance, but also the imaginative framework necessary to envision and fight for a better world. The legacy of these medieval festivals extended far beyond their immediate historical context. The traditions, practices, and ideas they fostered influenced later democratic movements, revolutionary struggles, and social transformations, from the English Civil War to the French Revolution to modern liberation movements. We can trace the influence of festivalgeneted ideas about popular sovereignty, collective action, and social transformation. Understanding this hidden history of medieval festivals reveals that what appeared to be chaotic, frivolous celebrations were actually sophisticated schools for revolution. They taught oppressed communities the skills, strategies, and mindset necessary for challenging entrenched power structures. This redistribution wasn't charity. It was an assertion of collective ownership that directly challenged feudal concepts of private property. The most dangerous aspect was how festivals normalized collective action against authority. When hundreds of peasants successfully organized complex celebrations, managed resources, resolved disputes, and maintained order without noble oversight, they proved to themselves that they didn't need lords to govern their communities. Festival committees became training grounds for future rebellion leaders, and the networks formed during celebrations provided the infrastructure for organizing resistance movements. The authorities initially tolerated these festivals because they seemed to provide a safety valve for social tensions. Better to let peasants play at revolution for a few days than face actual uprisings, they reasoned. But this calculation proved catastrophically wrong. Rather than dissipating revolutionary energy, festivals concentrated and refined it. They gave peasants a shared vocabulary of resistance, practical experience in collective action, and most importantly, a vivid demonstration that alternative social arrangements were possible. The connection between festival culture and actual rebellion becomes clear when examining the timing and leadership of major peasant uprisings. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 erupted during traditional festival season, and many of its leaders had previously served as lords of misrule or festival organizers. The rebels used the same communication networks, organizational structures, and even symbolic language they developed through years of festival participation. What made medieval festivals truly wild wasn't just their surface chaos. It was their function as incubators for revolutionary consciousness in a society designed to convince people that inequality was natural and unchangeable. These celebrations offered proof that the social order was arbitrary and fragile. They transformed subjects into citizens, if only temporarily, and that transformation proved impossible to fully reverse. The wildness of medieval festivals reflected the wildness of possibility they unleashed. The intoxicating, terrifying recognition that the world could be fundamentally different if enough people decided to make it so. Here's part 8 of the script for why medieval festivals were so wild. As we've explored the profound ways medieval festivals inverted social hierarchies and fostered revolutionary consciousness, we must delve deeper into how these seemingly chaotic celebrations became sophisticated psychological laboratories where the oppressed learned to imagine and enact radical social transformation. The festivals didn't merely provide temporary relief from hardship. They functioned as comprehensive training programs in collective resistance, teaching skills that would prove invaluable when peasants eventually rose up against their oppressors. Consider the intricate planning required for major festival celebrations. Peasants and craftsmen couldn't simply wait for their lords to organize entertainment for them. Instead, they had to coordinate elaborate processions, theatrical performances, and communal feasts across multiple villages and towns. This planning process was itself revolutionary. Workers who spent their daily lives taking orders suddenly found themselves debating logistics, allocating resources, and making collective decisions. They learned to organize committees, delegate responsibilities, and resolve disputes through democratic discussion rather than feudal decree. The Festival of Fools, celebrated throughout medieval Europe, exemplified this transformative educational process. For weeks before the celebration, peasants would secretly meet in taverns, workshops, and fields to plan their elaborate performances. They would choose which authority figures to mock, craft satirical songs and skits, and design costumes that would allow them to safely ridicule their oppressors. These planning sessions were essentially clandestine political meetings where the downtrodden learned to articulate their grievances, strategize collective action, and build solidarity across class lines. During these preparatory gatherings, peasants discovered they shared common experiences of exploitation and abuse. A blacksmith might reveal how the local lord had seized his best tools as taxes. A farmer might describe watching his crops confiscated, while his children went hungry. A weaver might tell of being forced to work without pay for weeks on end. These shared stories of suffering created powerful bonds of solidarity and helped participants understand that their individual hardships were actually symptoms of a larger system of oppression. The festivals also provided crucial practice in collective courage. Standing up to authority figures required enormous bravery in a society where insubordination could result in severe punishment or death. But during festivals, peasants could gradually build their confidence by participating in increasingly bold acts of symbolic rebellion. They might start by simply laughing at a satirical song about their lord, then progress to joining in the singing, and eventually work up to performing their own mocking skits. Each small act of defiance helped overcome the psychological conditioning that normally kept them submissive. The temporary nature of these rebellious activities was actually crucial to their effectiveness as training exercises, because everyone understood that normal social relations would resume after the festival. Participants could experiment with resistance without immediately facing the full consequences of outright revolt. This allowed them to practice the emotional and psychological skills needed for genuine rebellion while minimizing immediate risk. The physical organization of festival spaces also taught important lessons about alternative social arrangements. During major celebrations, traditional hierarchical seating arrangements were abandoned. Peasants and nobles might find themselves sharing the same benches, eating similar food, and participating in the same activities. These experiences gave the oppressed a visceral understanding that social hierarchies were artificial constructs rather than natural laws. They could see that lords and ladies were ordinary human beings who happened to occupy privileged positions, not divinely appointed superiors who deserved unquestioning obedience. The economic aspects of festivals provided equally important education and collective power. Organizing large celebrations required substantial resources that no individual peasant family could provide. But by pooling their meager savings and coordinating their labor, communities could create impressive spectacles that rivaled the entertainment provided by wealthy nobles. This taught participants that collective action could accomplish things that individual effort never could. They learned to recognize their potential strength when united and began to understand how their lords depended entirely on their continued cooperation and labor. The festivals also served as crucial networking opportunities, where isolated rural communities could connect with like-minded groups from other regions. Traveling performers, wandering merchants, and visiting craftsmen would carry news of successful uprisings, innovative resistance tactics, and inspiring examples of peasant solidarity from distant lands. These informal communication networks helped spread revolutionary ideas across vast geographical areas and allowed local grievances to connect with broader movements for social change. The music and poetry created for festivals played a particularly important role in developing revolutionary consciousness. Satirical songs that mocked authority figures weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated political commentary that helped audiences analyze and critique the power structures that oppressed them. These songs often contained coded messages about resistance tactics, celebrated historical examples of successful rebellions, and articulated visions of more just social arrangements. The memorable melodies and clever wordplay ensured that these revolutionary ideas would stick in people's minds long after the festivals ended. The theatrical performances during festivals provided even more explicit training in resistance. Peasants would act out elaborate dramas where corrupt officials were overthrown. Greedy nobles were punished, and ordinary people triumphed over their oppressors. These performances weren't just fantasy. Medieval festivals also subverted religious beliefs and practices, offering an alternative vision of the world that challenged official doctrine and promoted communal values. For much of the year, the Christian God demanded strict obedience from his flock. Sins were punished, questions were silenced, and earthly authority was fortified through divine right. But during festivals, a different kind of spirituality prevailed. In place of unquestioning piety, there was communal revelry. Instead of abstract theological disputes, there was earthy celebration of human joys and passions. And instead of blind faith in hierarchical structures, there was active participation in shaping community norms and values. The effects were both subtle and profound. When everyday people led prayers and sang Bodhi songs about saints, they reinforced the idea that religious practice should be accessible and enjoyable rather than dictated from above. When pagans and heretics found an audience among festival crowds, they demonstrated that unorthodox beliefs weren't as fringe as the church claimed. And when communities organized self-enforced morality through rituals like the Lord of Misrule, they showed that religious observance didn't require external coercion. One of the most startling examples of this subversive Christianity came during the celebrations of Corpus Christi, a holy day commemorating the body of Christ. While the church intended this procession as an occasion for solemn reflection, popular culture transformed it into a raucous street theater. The arrival of the host, or consecrated wafer, believed to contain Christ's actual body, was greeted not with hushed reverence, but with uproarious cheers and jeers. Mock miracles and otherworldly visions were described in comedic detail. Religious figures were lampooned, and even the Virgin Mary wasn't spared from playful ribbing. The English chronicler John of Fordun described the scene in vivid terms, saying that Corpus Christi festivities regularly descended into, quote, a disport full of martyry and no man could hear, rehearse the moqueries and taunts that went about. The implications were clear. By injecting humor and irreverence into the holiest of days, the people were undermining centuries of religious orthodoxy and demonstrating that accusable devotion didn't require blind obedience or fear of damnation. Their version of Christianity from below was inclusive, participatory, and firmly grounded in communal values rather than institutional pronouncements. This challenge to official doctrine was even more apparent in the widespread veneration of folk saints and relics that occurred outside the church's purview. Local heroes like St. George, Robin Hood, and King Arthur were celebrated in festivals that emphasized themes of community protection, rebellion against tyranny, and restoration of rightful authority. While the Catholic Church attempted to stamp out such celebrations as pagan survivals or diabolical inventions, they persisted precisely because they fulfilled spiritual needs neglected by official channels. The emphasis on protecting the innocent, resisting injustice, and restoring balance through heroic action resonated deeply with the struggles of ordinary people living under oppressive conditions. By sponsoring their own cults and rituals, peasants and townspeople forged a sense of independence from the clerical elite that controlled access to God. In the eyes of the church, this may have been heresy, but in the eyes of the community, it was a form of authentic piety rooted in shared experience and independent practice. But perhaps the most direct assault on established religion during medieval festivals was the proliferation of subversive songs, stories, and symbols. From Bodhi drinking songs to coded broadsides, from secret handshakes to hidden amulets, a rich culture of resistance flourished in the cracks of official society. The lyrics of popular songs were particularly explosive, mixing political commentary with scatological humor in ways that would make them unrecognizable to modern audiences. Drinking songs denigrated authority figures while elevating the virtues of good cheer and excess. Limericks pilloried the clergy with shocking frankness. Ballad-like laments chronicled the miseries of oppression with startling clarity. The potency of these songs lay in their simplicity. Sung in the vernacular rather than Latin, they reached audiences beyond the literate elite. And by grounding political grievances in universal human experiences like drinking, sex, and bodily functions, they made complex social issues immediately relatable. No medieval monarch or pope could hope to control this kind of grassroots expression. And as a result, subversive songs became key instruments of cultural resistance. To be sure, medieval festivals weren't solely about protest. They provided vital opportunities for communities to bond over shared traditions, reinforce group identity, and find momentary refuge from the pressures of everyday life. Think of the communal feasts, athletic competitions, theatrical performances, and boisterous games that drew people together. But it would be a mistake to view these recreational aspects as mere distractions from politics. In a society where work was inescapable and individual rights non-existent, festivals offered some of the only spaces where people could pursue pleasure and personal expression freely. The very fact that such moments of joy and abandon were so brutally curtailed the rest of the year made them all the more precious and powerful. For medieval people, festivals weren't just fun breaks from the grind of existence. They were crucial affirmations of their humanity. Amidst the grinding realities of feudal life, medieval festivals were not just celebrations, they were acts of defiance. Moments of collective liberation and laboratories for revolutionary thought. They gave voice to the voiceless, agency to the disempowered, and hope to the seemingly hopeless. Whether through subversive Christianity, coded expressions of resistance, or the simple act of coming together in joyous abandon, medieval festivals affirmed the enduring strength of community in the face of overwhelming odds. Their true spirit can best be captured in the words of the English chronicler John of Forden, describing the medieval festival of Lupercalia. Amidst the revelry, he wrote, quote, "There is such a mingling of youthful lust and licentious liberty that it is neither fitting nor becoming to write of it at length." In those few words, he captured the essence of medieval festivals. They were wild, they were liberating, and they were profoundly threatening to the social order. Those who sought to crush these festivals failed to understand that in the laughter, in the lust, and in the unadulterated joy, the seeds of lasting social change were being sown. As long as people came together in mass, as long as they sang their songs, told their subversive stories, and celebrated their shared humanity, the spirit of rebellion would endure. It would eventually break the medieval world's most cherished chains. Why? Medieval festivals were so wild. And if you want to learn more about what life was really like during the Middle Ages, stay tuned for more information. They demonstrated that ordinary people possessed the capacity for self-governance, collective action, and social transformation. And they proved that even the most rigid hierarchies could be shaken by the combined force of popular imagination, organizational skill, and collective courage. The wild nature of these festivals wasn't a bug in the medieval system. It was a feature that made revolutionary change possible. By providing regular opportunities for communities to experience alternative forms of social organization, these celebrations ensure that the seeds of transformation were constantly being planted, nurtured, and prepared to bloom when historical conditions became favorable for revolutionary action. Here is part 10 of the 12-part script for why medieval festivals were so wild. As we've seen, medieval festivals served as powerful catalysts for social transformation. But the mechanisms by which these celebrations fostered resistance and revolution ran far deeper than mere temporary role reversals. These gatherings functioned as sophisticated schools of insurrection, where the oppressed learned the practical skills and ideological frameworks necessary to challenge their overlords in the real world. Consider the Feast of Fools, that notorious December celebration where the lowest clergy assumed the highest offices in mock ceremonies that scandalized church authorities for centuries. What appeared to be simple blasphemous entertainment was actually a masterclass in organizational structure and alternative governance. When a lowly deacon donned the bishop's mitre and delivered sermons mocking church doctrine, he wasn't just providing comic relief for his fellow celebrants. That the supposedly divine hierarchy of the church could be dismantled and constructed by ordinary people with extraordinary audacity. These mock bishops learned to command attention, to organize elaborate processions, to delegate responsibilities to their temporary subordinates. They discovered that the machinery of power was far less mysterious than their superiors claimed. The skills they developed during these festival performances, the confidence they gained in assuming leadership roles, the networks they built among like-minded rebels, all of these elements would prove invaluable. When the time came for genuine resistance, The same pattern emerged in secular celebrations like the boy bishop festivals, where children temporarily ruled over adults with all the pomp and circumstance of legitimate authority. These weren't mere games or harmless diversions. They were exercises in imagining and practicing alternative social arrangements. When a 12-year-old boy commanded grown men to kneel before him, when he redistributed wealth from the rich to the poor, when he pardoned criminals and punished nobles for their arrogance, he was learning that power structures were malleable, that authority could be transferred, that the established order was far more fragile than anyone dared to admit. The adults who participated in these reversals were equally transformed by the experience. They learned to take orders from their supposed inferiors, to question the assumptions that kept them subservient, to envision worlds where merit rather than birth determined one's station in life. These lessons didn't disappear when the festivals ended. They fed in the collective consciousness, creating a reservoir of revolutionary potential that could be tapped when conditions became desperate enough. Medieval festivals also served as training grounds for the kind of collective action that would be essential for successful uprisings. The elaborate coordination required to stage these massive celebrations taught participants how to organize large groups of people around shared goals. They learned to pool resources, to assign roles based on individual strengths, to maintain secrecy when necessary, and to present a unified front against authority figures who tried to suppress their activities. The Charivari, those raucous nocturnal processions where communities would publicly shame individuals who violated social norms, provided particularly valuable lessons in mob psychology and crowd control. Participants learned how to channel collective anger into focused action, how to use noise and spectacle to intimidate their targets, how to maintain group cohesion even in the face of official retaliation. These skills would prove directly transferable to the peasant revolts that periodically erupted across medieval Europe. But perhaps most importantly, medieval festivals fostered the development of what we might call revolutionary consciousness, a shared understanding that the existing social order was neither natural nor inevitable. Through satirical performances, mocking songs, and symbolic inversions, these celebrations created space for people to articulate their grievances and imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. The carnival plays performed during Shrovetide were particularly subversive in this regard. These dramatic performances often featured plots where peasants outwitted nobles, where the poor triumphed over the rich, where traditional hierarchies were not just inverted, but completely destroyed. Audiences didn't just passively consume these fantasies, they internalized them, carrying these visions of justice and liberation back to their daily lives, where they served as inspiration for real-world resistance. The songs and chants that emerged from these festivals were equally revolutionary in their implications. These weren't abstract theological debates or scholarly treatises on political theory. They were simple, memorable verses that ordinary people could learn and repeat, spreading radical ideas through networks of oral tradition that were impossible for authorities to monitor or control. A ditty about a greedy lord getting his comeuppance might seem harmless enough, but when sung by thousands of voices across multiple villages, it became a form of ideological warfare. Medieval festivals also provided crucial opportunities for different communities to share information and coordinate resistance efforts. The traveling performers who moved from celebration to celebration carried more than just entertainment. They served as informal news networks, spreading word of successful uprisings, failed rebellions, new tactics for resisting authority, and emerging leaders who might be worth following. A juggler who had witnessed a peasant revolt in one region could share tactical knowledge with potential rebels in another, creating connections that transcended local boundaries. The timing of many medieval festivals coincided with periods of economic hardship and social tension, making them natural flashpoints for revolutionary activity. Harvest festivals brought together people who had just endured months of backbreaking labor for minimal compensation. Religious celebrations gathered communities that were already questioning the gap between church teachings about charity and the actual behavior of ecclesiastical authorities. These weren't coincidences. Festival organizers, whether consciously or unconsciously, understood that celebrations could serve as cover for more serious political activities. The anarctic atmosphere of these events made them ideal venues for recruiting potential revolutionaries and testing their commitment to radical change. Someone who is willing to mock a lord during a festival might be persuaded to join a more serious conspiracy against that same lord. Someone who enjoyed redistributing wealth during a carnival might be ready to participate in actual property seizures when the opportunity arose. Medieval authorities understood the revolutionary potential of these celebrations, which explains their persistent efforts to regulate, control, or suppress them entirely. Church officials regularly issued edicts against the Feast of Fools. Secular rulers tried to limit the scope of carnival activities, and local magistrates attempted to monitor festival gatherings for signs of seditious behavior. But their very efforts to contain these celebrations only confirmed their power and importance. The cat-and-mouse game between festival organizers and authorities created its own form of resistance training. Celebrants learned to operate in gray areas of legality, to use coded language and symbolic gestures to communicate dangerous ideas, to maintain plausible deniability when questioned by suspicious officials. These skills in subterfuge and misdirection would prove invaluable during actual revolutionary movements. The legacy of medieval festivals as schools of revolution can be traced through the major peasant uprisings that erupted across Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, the German Peasants' War of 1524. All of these movements drew on organizational models, rhetorical strategies, and ideological frameworks that had been developed and refined during centuries of festival celebrations. When Wat Tyler led his followers to London in 1381, he wasn't inventing revolutionary tactics from scratch. He was drawing on a rich tradition of collective action that had been honed during countless May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and religious processions. The rebels' ability to coordinate their movements across multiple counties, their skill in using symbolic gestures to communicate their demands, their understanding of how to present themselves as legitimate representatives of popular will. All of these capabilities had been developed during decades of festival participation. The revolutionary potential of medieval festivals extended beyond their immediate participants to influence broader patterns of social change. The ideas and practices that emerged from these celebrations spread through networks of kinship, trade, and religious affiliation, creating cultural currents that would eventually reshape European society. The emphasis on equality and justice that characterized many festival traditions helped lay the groundwork for later democratic movements. While the critique of arbitrary authority that these celebrations embodied would eventually contribute to the development of constitutional government and individual rights, even the aesthetic dimensions of medieval festivals served revolutionary purposes. The elaborate costumes, masks, and decorations that characterized these events weren't just entertainment. They were tools for exploring identity and challenging social categories. When a peasant donned the robes of a king, when a woman dressed as a man, when a fool proclaimed himself a sage, they were experimenting with the idea that social roles were performances rather than natural facts. This understanding would prove crucial for later movements that sought to expand opportunities for social mobility and challenge. Traditional hierarchies. The communal nature of festival preparation also fostered the kind of solidarity and mutual aid that would be essential for successful resistance movements. The months of planning that went into major celebrations required unprecedented levels of cooperation between individuals who might otherwise compete for scarce resources. Peasants learned to share tools and materials. Artisans collaborated on elaborate projects, and entire communities pulled their resources to create spectacular displays. These experiences of collective achievement demonstrated that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together toward common goals. Medieval festivals thus served as far more than temporary escapes from the grinding realities of daily life. They were laboratories for social experimentation, training grounds for revolutionary activity, and incubators for the ideas and practices that would eventually transform European society through their careful cultivation of alternative values. Their systematic inversion of traditional hierarchies and their creation of spaces for collective action and mutual aid. These celebrations helped prepare the ground for the social movements that would ultimately bring the medieval world to an end. The wild and chaotic nature of these festivals wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The apparent disorder masked sophisticated forms of organization and resistance that authorities found difficult to detect or counter. Behind the laughter and revelry lay serious preparation for the revolutionary changes that would reshape the world. Medieval festivals were wild precisely because they were dangerous, because they carried within them the seeds of transformation that would eventually bloom into new forms of social organization based on principles of equality, justice, and human dignity. Based on the script summary and reference materials, here's part 11 of why medieval festivals were so wild. In the tapestry of medieval life, few threads were as vibrant, as multifaceted as the festivals that pulsed with the energy of communal joy and liberation. As we delve deeper into the psychological mechanisms that made medieval festivals so transformative, we must examine how these celebrations functioned as sophisticated schools of revolution, disguised as harmless entertainment. The seemingly chaotic revelry that characterized these events was actually a carefully orchestrated system of social education that prepared communities for the impossibility of genuine uprising. The French medieval scholar and author of the Manners and Customs of France in the 14th century, Jean Fauvart de Varens, provides us with an enlightening comparison between the festivities of Shrovetide and those of the Feast of Fools Shrovetide, or Mardi Gras, marked the period before Lent, when Christians were expected to repent and prepare for their upcoming sacrifices. Communities would stage elaborate proceedings where unpopular authority figures were tried for their crimes against the people. Many celebrations incorporated millenarian themes, drawing on Christian prophecies about a coming age when the last would be first and the first would be last. Robin Hood, Till Eulenspiegel, and countless other trickster figures represented the possibility of challenging authority through wit, courage, and solidarity with the oppressed. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for resistance, teaching specific tactics and strategies while celebrating the moral legitimacy of fighting against injustice. By embodying these heroic archetypes, festival participants internalize values of defiance and nonconformity. How did these celebrations challenge your preconceived notions about the Middle Ages? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to stay tuned for more captivating historical tales. They learned to question rigid rules and challenge those who wielded power over them. These weren't distant theological concepts, were immediate promises that the current order was temporary and that divine justice would eventually prevail. Traveling performers, wandering scholars, and itinerant traders carried news, ideas, and inspiration from one celebration to another. They were essential tools for cultivating revolutionary thought and behavior. Within the context of medieval culture, festivals like Carnival, Shrovetide, and the Feast of Fools provided a space where traditional power structures were subverted, and the possibility of a better world was both imagined and practiced. By shedding their everyday identities, embracing egalitarian customs, reenacting alternative scenarios, and celebrating subversive heroes, communities forged new ways of thinking about their place in society and their relationship to authority. It was as if every year they collectively whispered, "What if we could do things differently? What if we challenge the rules that govern us? What if we envision a world where justice prevails and everyone has a chance to thrive?" While the longevity and impact of these revolutionary seeds depended on a multitude of factors, the festivals themselves remained steadfastly subversive, reminding people year after year that life didn't have to be this way. There was always the possibility, however distant, of transformation and liberation. A successful uprising in one region could be discussed and analyzed at festivals throughout the continent, spreading both practical knowledge and revolutionary fervor. These informal communication networks were far more effective than formal diplomatic channels, creating a kind of underground railroad for radical ideas. The festivals made these prophecies tangible, offering glimpses of what the promised transformation might look like in practice. Moreover, the identification of Jesus with figures like Robin Hood or Till Eulenspiegel, outlaws who defied authority to help the poor and challenged the privileges of the wealthy, further blurred the lines between oppressors and the oppressed. If Jesus could identify with the marginalized, then so could ordinary people. He had been mocked and scorned, misunderstood and betrayed by those in power. They understood what it meant to be falsely accused, unjustly punished, and denied a fair trial. The empathy and understanding fostered during festivals laid the foundation for solidarity and collective action. These weren't merely symbolic gestures. They were detailed explorations of legal reasoning, evidence gathering, and collective decision-making. Participants learned to articulate grievances, present arguments, and reach consensus through democratic processes. They practiced the very skills they would need if they ever decided to hold real trials for real oppressors. The economic redistribution that occurred during festivals also served as a powerful demonstration of alternative social arrangements. When wealthy merchants were expected to provide free food and entertainment for the entire community, when nobles opened their storehouses to the poor, when guildmasters shared their finest goods. With apprentices, people experienced what a more equitable society might feel like. These weren't abstract political theories, were lived experiences of abundance and generosity that proved such arrangements were practically possible. Furthermore, the festivals emphasized communal ownership and cooperation. The erection of maypoles, the construction of pageant wagons, and the organization of theatrical performances required shared labor and resources. People from different social backgrounds worked side by side, reinforcing the idea that their collective efforts could bring about tangible results. This sense of accomplishment and empowerment was a potent challenge to the prevailing social order, suggesting that the hierarchical divisions imposed by elites were ultimately unnecessary and detrimental. In contrast, the Feast of Fools, celebrated around New Year's Day, honored the child Jesus and allowed for merriment and light-hearted mockery of church rituals. A lowly dock worker could don the mask of a nobleman and walk freely through the city's most exclusive districts, experiencing firsthand what it felt like to command respect and deference. Meanwhile, actual nobles might disguise themselves as commoners, gaining insight into the daily struggles of their subjects. This wasn't merely playful role reversal, it was a systematic dismantling of the psychological barriers that normally kept social classes rigidly separated. The revelers were literally embodying the concept of noli me tangere, meaning do not touch me, a phrase associated with the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, when he appeared so radiant that his disciples were initially unable to recognize him. By donning masks that obscured their features, festival participants shed not only their physical identities, but also the social baggage that came with them. They were transformed into something other, something unrecognizable, and therefore free from the constraints of their usual roles and interactions. This radical disorientation allowed for a profound reevaluation of social norms and power dynamics. When someone could convincingly portray a member of the nobility for a festival, what real difference was there between them and the actual noble? This revelation undermined the legitimacy of hereditary privilege, exposing it as arbitrary and superficial. If someone could convincingly play the role of nobility for a festival, what made actual nobility legitimate beyond accident of birth and accumulated wealth? This process of self-discovery and empowerment was further reinforced through the festival's elaborate theatrical performances, which often featured thinly veiled critiques of existing power structures. Mystery plays might depict corrupt judges being dragged to hell, while folktales celebrated clever peasants outwitting greedy lords. The audience wasn't passive. They participated actively, shouting suggestions, booing villains, and cheering heroes. Through this interactive storytelling, communities developed shared narratives about justice, fairness, and the possibility of change. These stories didn't just entertain, they instilled values and inspired action. According to Fauvet, during Shrovetide, a deep sadness pervaded the land. People went about, dressed in gray, singing mournful songs and making solemn processions. Even young children were somber, abstaining from games and remaining silent. Only after Shrove Tuesday, when the joyful season of Carnival began, did laughter and good cheer return. Fauvet suggests that the sudden shift in atmosphere was so dramatic that it seemed almost miraculous, and he attributes this astonishing transformation to the release of human nature from the constraints of decorum. However, there is more to this apparent miracle than meets the eye. For within the framework of medieval culture, the festival's capacity to instill hope for a better world transcended mere escapism. It embodied a potent critique of the status quo, laying the groundwork for potential revolution. Consider the festival of Carnival in late medieval Venice, where elaborate masks allowed participants to assume entirely different identities for weeks at a time. The mock trials that were a staple of many festivals served as particularly effective training grounds for revolutionary thinking. The religious dimensions of these festivals added another layer of revolutionary significance. The development of folk heroes and legendary figures through festival traditions provided communities with powerful symbols of resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the festivals created networks of solidarity that extended far beyond individual communities. In conclusion, medieval festivals weren't just vibrant expressions of popular culture. But now it's time to hear from you. What aspects of medieval festivals fascinated you the most? Even when authorities managed to suppress the most overtly political elements, the fundamental experience of collective empowerment, social inversion, and imaginative possibility continued to work its transformative magic on participants. The cumulative effect of decades or centuries of festival participation was the creation of communities with deeply ingrained habits of resistance, cooperation, and visionary thinking. When real crises emerged, when harvests failed, or wars devastated the countryside, when corrupt officials pushed too far, or new taxes became unbearable, these communities were prepared to respond collectively rather than suffering in isolation. The peasant uprisings that periodically convulsed medieval Europe weren't spontaneous explosions of rage. They were the logical culmination of generations of festival-based political education. The organizational skills, the revolutionary consciousness, the networks of solidarity, and the practical experience of alternative social arrangements that festivals provided, all came together when historical circumstances made genuine change possible. Understanding medieval festivals as schools of revolution helps explain their persistence despite periodic attempts at suppression. They weren't just harmless entertainment that authorities could afford to tolerate. They were essential institutions for maintaining social stability, while simultaneously nurturing the seeds of its transformation. This paradox lies at the heart of why medieval festivals were so wild, so persistent, and ultimately so influential in shaping the trajectory of European civilization. The legacy of these festivals extended far beyond the medieval period. The democratic traditions, the concepts of popular sovereignty, the practices of collective organization, the imaginative frameworks for social transformation that they fostered, would eventually contribute to the great political revolutions of the early modern period. In this sense, every medieval festival was both a celebration of the present moment and a rehearsal for the future that was yet to come. As we've journeyed through the labyrinthine corridors of medieval festival culture, we've witnessed how these seemingly chaotic celebrations served as sophisticated mechanisms of social transformation, psychological release, and political resistance. But perhaps their most profound legacy lies in what they reveal about the human capacity to find joy, meaning, and solidarity, even within the most oppressive systems. These festivals were not merely escapes from the harsh realities of medieval life. They were laboratories where alternative possibilities were tested, where new forms of social organization were practiced, and where the seeds of future revolutions were carefully planted and nurtured. When a peasant donned the robes of a mock bishop during the Feast of Fools, they weren't simply playing dress-up. They were experiencing, however briefly, what it felt like to wield authority, to command respect, to be heard and obeyed. This experiential knowledge became a powerful psychological tool, expanding their understanding of what was possible and challenging the seemingly immutable nature of their social position. The theatrical performances that formed the backbone of many festivals served a similar function. When villagers watched passion plays or morality tales, they weren't merely being entertained or educated. They were participating in complex negotiations about power, justice, and social order. These performances provided safe spaces to explore dangerous ideas, to question authority, and to imagine different ways of organizing society. The fact that these plays often featured reversals of fortune where the lowly were raised up and the mighty brought low was uncoincidental. It was a deliberate strategy to help audiences envision and emotionally prepare for social transformation. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval festivals demonstrated the power of collective action and decision-making during events. It's like harvest celebrations or May Day festivities. Entire communities would come together to make decisions about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and community priorities. These weren't simply administrative exercises. They were practical training sessions in democratic governance, teaching participants how to negotiate, compromise, and build consensus. The skills developed during these festival gatherings would prove invaluable during times of crisis, when communities needed to organize resistance movements or coordinate uprisings. The economic dimensions of these festivals were equally significant. The temporary suspension of normal economic relationships, the sharing of food and drink, the redistribution of wealth through gift-giving and charitable acts, the collective ownership of festival resources provided concrete examples of alternative economic systems. Participants experienced firsthand what it felt like to live in a society where abundance was shared rather than hoarded, where mutual aid replaced competition, where human needs took precedence over profit. These experiences created powerful emotional and psychological foundations for later economic revolts and reform movements. But perhaps the most enduring impact of medieval festivals was their role in building and strengthening social networks. The bonds formed during these celebrations between different social classes, between urban and rural populations, between members of different guilds or professions created invisible webs of connection that could be activated during times of crisis. When the Peasants' Revolt erupted in 1381, it spread with remarkable speed and coordination across England. Not because of any formal organizational structure, but because of the informal networks that had been built and maintained through decades of festival participation. These festivals also served as crucial spaces for the preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge. The songs, stories, dances, and rituals that formed the core of festival celebrations weren't simply entertainment. They were repositories of collective memory, containing within them the history, values, and aspirations of entire communities. Through participation in these cultural practices, individuals were initiated into broader traditions of resistance and solidarity that stretched back generations and would continue long after the specific grievances of their time had been resolved. The psychological functions of these festivals cannot be understated. In a world characterized by grinding poverty, constant threat of violence, and seemingly insurmountable inequality, festivals provided essential mechanisms for maintaining mental and emotional health. The cathartic release of pent-up frustrations, the temporary suspension of social constraints, the opportunity to express creativity and imagination. All of these elements helped individuals cope with the daily stresses of medieval life, while simultaneously preparing them for more sustained forms of resistance. The ritualistic aspects of these celebrations were particularly important in this regard. The elaborate ceremonies, symbolic inversions, and sacred dramas that characterized many festivals didn't just entertain participants. They helped them process trauma, work through grief, and find meaning in suffering. These rituals provided frameworks for understanding and responding to injustice, offering both emotional healing and practical guidance for future action. As medieval society gradually transformed into the early modern period, many of these festival traditions were suppressed or co-opted by emerging state and church. Authorities who recognized their subversive potential, the spontaneous community-controlled celebrations that had flourished in the medieval period were increasingly replaced by officially sanctioned events. Designed to reinforce rather than challenge existing power structures, this transition marked a significant loss not just of cultural traditions, but of the spaces and practices that had allowed ordinary people to imagine and work towards social transformation. Yet the legacy of medieval festivals lived on in various forms. The democratic traditions that emerged in later centuries, the labor movements that fought for workers' rights, the social movements that challenged racial and gender inequality. All of these drew consciously, or unconsciously, on practices and principles that had been developed and refined in medieval festival culture. The techniques of collective decision-making, the strategies for building cross-class alliances, the methods for using culture and performance as tools of resistance, all of these had their roots in the seemingly innocent celebrations that had punctuated the medieval calendar. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the profound political significance of cultural practices that might otherwise seem frivolous or inconsequential. It reminds us that social transformation doesn't only happen through formal political processes or dramatic revolutionary upheavals. It also occurs through the slow, patient work of building alternative communities, practicing new forms of social organization, and expanding collective imagination about what might be possible. Medieval festivals were wild precisely because they had to be, because only in spaces of apparent chaos and disorder could the careful work of social transformation take place without triggering immediate repression. Behind the masks and costumes, beneath the revelry and apparent frivolity, serious business was being conducted. The business of building a more just and equitable world. In recognizing this legacy, we honor not only the ingenuity and courage of our medieval ancestors, but also the ongoing human struggle for dignity, justice, and collective liberation that continues to this day. These celebrations remind us that even in the darkest times, even under the most oppressive conditions, human beings have found ways to resist, to hope, and to work together toward better futures. The medieval festival tradition stands as a testament to the enduring power of collective action, cultural creativity, and shared imagination in the long struggle for human freedom and dignity.